Thank you for joining us for the inaugural launch of Hudson Institute's American Energy Initiative, featuring a conversation with U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan. I'm Brigham McCown, Senior Fellow and Director of the initiative. Senator, if I can introduce you for just a second before we get started, good to see you as well. No newcomer to energy policy. You served on the White House National Security Council, were an Assistant Secretary of State, the Alaska DNR Commissioner, the Alaska Attorney General, U.S. Senator, and United States Marine. What did I leave out?
No, you mentioned the best was the last one, but that's a whole nother topic.
States Marine.
As a naval aviator, you know that.
Yes, sir. And I also understand that you were recently congratulated as being a clean energy champion.
Yes, I'm an all of the above champion.
And that was for, in part, your leadership in passing the Infrastructure Investment Act and the Growing Climate Solutions Act.
Well, listen, it's great to be here. And I want to do a shout out to Hudson for launching this initiative. The issue of energy security is literally the issue of our time. It's been that way for years. A lot of people who didn't think so have now awoken to the need for energy security, particularly in the aftermath of the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But to me, energy security is one of the most important issues we're working on here. And the ideas between the Democrats and Republicans on this, you couldn't have a more distinct and different approach. And I think our approach is the one that benefits the American people the most and certainly benefits our national security the most. And by the way, Brigham, one thing that's not talked about enough, and benefits the environment the most.
Well, why do you think that over, say, the last 10 or 20 years, we've really gotten away from talking about energy security? We talk about climate change, climate policy, but really don't mention that word of tying security to energy.
Well, I think that's changing, right? In the aftermath, as I mentioned, of the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, what it's done, it's highlighted in so many ways the policies, particularly that the far left has pushed on America, has pushed on Europe, as policies that really undermine not just national security, but the ability to get by having affordable energy, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've seen, particularly with the Biden administration, is this dramatic spike in energy prices across the board, like you're seeing in Europe, much worse in Europe, like you're seeing in the UK. Every place that has kind of fully embraced far left, Green New Deal type of policies has done so in a way that the result has been very predictable. Higher energy costs on average Americans, average Europeans, and undermining the national security and energy security of our country. You're seeing it in a big way in Europe, but you're seeing it in the United States as well. And one thing I always like to remind people, when you listen to the rhetoric, when you listen to far left radicals like Gina McCarthy, they actually want higher prices. Right? This is not some kind of, aspect of their energy policies that's tangential to what they're trying to get done. They talk about it when they're talking honestly, that driving up American energy prices has enabled them to, quote, accelerate the pathway to renewables. This is the way the far left talks. And when you think about it, they want to put higher energy prices on working families. It is a policy that, like I said, harms our economy, harms American working families, undermines national security. And the other issue I always like to highlight, it undermines the environment as well. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about how that happens.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I've heard some in the current administration literally refer to it as their shock and awe campaign, that it's intentional. And
intentional in terms of prices.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
No, I think it is. And if you listen to the rhetoric, when they're telling the truth, they want to drive up. It's purposeful on what we've seen happen since the Biden administration got into office, and that is a dramatic increase in energy prices for the average American, small businesses, And we're seeing it in Europe in a huge way.
Do you think Europe is a microcosm of what could happen in the United States? And by that I mean, there are some who suggest that the development of renewables in Europe has only been possible because of cheap fossil fuel, Russian oil and gas, and that without that oil and gas, the energy mix, renewables just aren't quite ready for prime time.
It's a great point. And what's happened is I have found so many of the administration officials, when you have a discussion with them, they're actually not that smart on the energy policies that they're trying to bring forward. But we know from day one, the Biden administration focused on 4 key areas. 1, shutting down and delaying the production of American energy. I see this all the time in my great state, the great state of Alaska. 2, delaying and even stopping energy infrastructure. Of course, Keystone XL was kind of the key to that, but they're doing it everywhere they can to stop the ability to move oil and gas, primarily through pipelines. 3rd is they have both pressured financial institutions and then put forward senior executive branch officials who are all hostile to the energy sector, and they've pressured Wall Street to choke off capital to the American energy sector. These are all facts. These are all facts. The 4th one, when they realize, oh my goodness, look at our policies, they're dramatically driving up prices in America on American citizens, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe this is our policies that are causing that. They're not letting up on their policies. They're going around the world begging dictators like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, heck, even the Iranians, to produce more energy for the American people. It's so mind-numbingly stupid that this could happen, that literally when the president went to Saudi Arabia on bended knee to ask that dictatorship for more oil, my point was, Mr. President, why don't you send an envoy to Alaska and we can produce more with American workers, American energy, the highest standards on the environment. Brigham, you know how high our standards are on the environment in Alaska. That's their 4-part policy, and it's unbelievable how it undermines every interest that we have: national security, energy security, working families, our economy, and yes, the environment. As you know, like I said, if you need energy, you should get it from places with the highest standards on production, highest standards on the environment in the world. That's Alaska. It's certainly not Saudi Arabia. It's not Venezuela. It's not Iran. So this is a monumentally, strategically misguided policy that this administration continues to pursue.
Well, speaking of the home state of Alaska, where the Trans-Alaska Pipeline is running at 25% of capacity.
Yes, you know that very well.
Yes, yet...
Having been in charge of it.
Yes, and they could certainly use the oil, and Alaska has the oil and natural gas.
Certainly do.
Have we forgotten the lessons of the 70s by being dependent on dictatorships, as you've mentioned, for our raw materials and for energy, and the pain that we went through?
Yeah.
Not just in price, but economically, gas rationing. Have people forgotten that?
Not rational people, but this administration certainly has forgotten that, and so have many of the far left radical environmental groups that have a really strong say with this administration. And you're exactly right. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was developed in the wake of the first Arab oil embargo against the United States in the early 70s. So to me, in Alaska, we've always known that energy security is national security. And there's an awakening, as I mentioned, in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, to that notion of energy security is national security. But here's the thing. I like to talk about how we're in this new era of authoritarian aggression led by Putin and led by Xi Jinping, the dictator of the Chinese Communist Party. But one of the key strategic advantages we actually have, particularly over China, but as it relates to Russia too, is our natural resource sector, is our energy sector. And I find it remarkable that this incredible American strength that we have, and we do it better than any other country in the world in terms of production of American energy, how we literally have a federal government with the Biden administration that's focused on unilaterally surrendering that comparative advantage to our adversaries. It makes no sense, and I think most Americans understand that.
So just a few years ago, we were practically energy independent, thanks in large part to the shale revolution.
Correct.
What 3 or 4 things can and should this administration do practically overnight to reverse course?
Well, first they have to let us produce on American lands. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, the fact is that a lot of American production occurs on public lands, and that's a big part of the production in Alaska, both state and federal lands. When you have an administration that clearly indicates that they don't want more production on public lands, that is a huge way to reduce production. They've been very good at it. The statistics came out recently showing that the Biden administration has offered less leases than any time since, I think, the 1940s. I mean, the facts are they have to reverse that. They have to make it easier, not harder, to produce on public lands. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, they're all focused on delaying infrastructure to move energy, and they have to change that. And the third area, which I think is so important, and it's really, really harming to places like Alaska, is this focus on choking off capital to the American energy sector. Think about it. 2 of the top administration officials who were appointed, we fortunately were able to block their confirmation despite being in the minority in the U.S. Senate, but one was the comptroller of the currency, this official named Ms. Amarova. She literally was a communist, right? She went to Moscow State, and I'm not talking Moscow, Idaho, right? The real deal. Was a Lenin Marxist scholar there, but she was nominated to be comptroller of the currency, and she was quoted as saying one of her goals was to, quote, bankrupt the small oil and gas businesses in America. I mean, think about the message that sends to that sector of our economy. And then you had this Federal Reserve nominee, Ms. Raskin, who was similarly focused on trying to bankrupt the American energy sector as a Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Now, fortunately, we were able to stop both of these. I was proud to say I led the effort on both of them. But think about the message that sends. Senior financial nominees for the U.S. federal government, whose job is finance, Federal Reserve, comptroller of the currency, and one of their big attributes, according to the Biden administration, was their hostility to American energy. I mean, again, this is nuts. And we've been able to block some of it, but the Biden administration needs to wake up just about in terms of the damage they're doing to our nation.
And so when we talk about capital deployment, companies are reluctant to invest where there's risk.
Right.
And what you're saying is the very mechanisms that these people are fostering raise the risk profile and disincentivize investment.
Absolutely. And if you think that it's not just the banks, and I talk to all the CEOs from Wall Street who make these big pronouncements, particularly, hey, we're not going to do any more investment in America's Arctic and the energy sector. You've seen firms do that. Trust me, I make phone calls to every one of those CEOs who make those big grand pronouncements. They're not pleasant phone calls because I'm like, hey, what are you doing? That's my state. Why would you blackball hardworking Alaskans who are producing what our nation needs, oil and gas with the highest labor standards, highest environmental standards? I've noticed your bank has no problem, investing in AI with regard to the Chinese Communist Party and quantum computing, but you're going to blackball American workers in the energy sector, again, it makes no sense. I do think there's a reckoning coming. I think the average American wants more American energy. The average American knows how important it is to our country's energy security, our economy, and national defense, to the environment. And I think people are getting really tired of these woke CEOs and far left executive branch officials who are trying to shut down American energy production. It makes no sense, and the average American understands that.
So one of the things you've been talking about or discussing is the ability to produce energy here in a far more environmentally friendly manner
Correct.
than producing overseas.
Yes.
And you have a chart.
Wow, my favorite chart.
You have a chart.
Good. I'm glad you're showing it.
Which I'd like to show, but could you, and we'll put it up on the screen here, but what does this say and what does it mean? Can you walk us through the
So
chart?
look, I trot that chart out all the time. I trot it out in hearings. I trot it out in floor speeches. And by the way, the far left media has fact-checked the heck out of that because they hate that chart, right? You're never going to see that chart in the New York Times or Washington Post. But none of them have been able to dispute it because those are the facts. And here's what it says. Since 2005, the country in the world that has reduced greenhouse gas emissions more than any other major economy by far is the United States of America. Okay, by far, almost 15% reduction since 2005. Now, at the same time, that chart shows the explosion in greenhouse gas emissions from China and India. Okay, so a couple important points from that chart. I'll give you an example. Environment and Public Works Committee hearing for the nominee to be the number 3 guy at the EPA in charge of air quality.
The assistant administrator for
Yes.
air and radiation.
I showed him the chart. Of course, he had no idea. This guy was going to be in charge of, in essence, what's going on in that chart. And I asked him, well, how do you think this happened? What do you think happened here? Right? Well, Senator, maybe the regulations from the EPA? No, right? It has nothing to do with the EPA. As you know, as the people in this sector who are actually informed know, that chart has to do with the revolution and the production of American natural gas. Yes. Not just for us, but then the ability to export it. So one of the things I always mention with regard to that chart is that if we can export more LNG to countries around the world, particularly countries that rely on other forms of power generation who are hungry for LNG, we could have a giant impact on continuing to reduce emissions, whether it's sending LNG to Japan or Taiwan or Europe or Korea or India, heck, even China. I'm fine with that, clean burning American LNG. But again, you have this disconnect in this administration. You literally have guys like John Kerry who have no clue on the issue he's supposedly in charge of. He wouldn't know, the importance of that chart if it smacked him in the head. Who's gone over to Japan and told them, don't buy American LNG. Like, whose side is this guy on, right? So that's an important chart to get out there. It shows that we're actually a leader in this area because of the production of American natural gas, in that will dramatically help reduce global emissions. But again, the people on the far left don't want to acknowledge that. They don't acknowledge that. They think you can go from coal to wind turbines and solar overnight in every country, and no country has ever done that, including ours.
So you sound like a realist.
I guess you would call me an optimistic realist.
An optimistic realist. And even the Obama administration, even if they didn't necessarily back it up, at least their stated policy was that they agreed in an all-the-above approach to energy.
That's correct.
So that's an energy mix of both fossil fuels and renewables. And one of the things you just mentioned on LNG pairs very nicely with renewables.
Correct.
For baseload energy, right?
Yeah. Well, look, I think you're raising a really good point. President Obama's view on a lot of issues was all of the above. There are quotes and speeches that President Obama gave that were very supportive of the American natural gas revolution. So it's an interesting point. I raise it a lot, where the last Democratic administration was generally supportive of all of the above. Of course, the Trump administration, working with Republicans in the Senate, we got to that point of American energy independence, which had been a long-term bipartisan goal of administrations dating back to World War II, the last time we were the world's energy superpower. So when the Biden administration came in, you said, well, he was the vice president under President Obama. He probably gets this. The hard left turn to these irrational policies of actually trying to reduce the production of American energy is a stunning turn from where President Biden was then vice president. But again, it undermines so much of what we try to do in this country, which is advancing our energy security, our economic opportunities, our national security, and the environment. The Biden administration, in my view, is failing in all four of those categories.
So you have proposed the American Energy,
Yes.
Jobs, and Climate Plan.
Yes.
What will that do?
Well, again, this builds on what we did during the Trump administration. And to be honest, when you look at the policies of the Obama administration, this isn't that different from that. We thought this would be a very strong bipartisan plan. We had a number of Republican senators who came out and supported it. It was principally driven by me, Senator Kramer, and Senator Lummis. And the whole goal was looking at an all-of-the-above energy mix with a strong reliance on gas, the way we were talking about that. And then how do we get there, and how do we leverage not just energy, but America's critical minerals as well. So it was very focused on the production of American energy, all of the above: solar, nuclear, oil, gas, hydro, looking at the incredible resources we not only have in the energy sector, but the critical mineral sector, which we need so much for our renewable sector, for our national defense, and then undertaking very significant permitting reform, which is so needed across so many sectors of our country as a way to rapidly achieve that energy independence. This would have the benefit of national security being enhanced, economic security being enhanced, and as we mentioned, in the rollout of our energy plan, a dramatically positive impact on the environment, because that chart you just showed would be accelerated by increasing the export of clean-burning American natural gas around the world, which would have very strong positive impacts on reducing global emissions. So, comprehensive plan introduced before the invasion of Ukraine. And now a lot of people are looking at this plan saying, wow, that really makes sense. So we're getting a second look at it. I hope that your viewers can take a hard look at it. We think it's a really common sense approach to energy in America, to critical minerals in America, that should be getting broad bipartisan support.
And we'll try to provide a link to that.
Yeah, please do.
But in our closing minutes, speaking of critical minerals, and this could be an entire another 30-minute conversation, are we at risk of changing one form of dependency, former dependency on Middle Eastern oil, for future dependency on China, speaking of critical minerals, rare earth materials? Absolutely we are.
And the sad thing is once again, through the lack of leadership in America, it doesn't have to be this way. You know, we were self-sufficient on the vast majority of the critical minerals we needed to drive our economy, to drive our national defense industry, as recently as the early 1980s. So much of that has been outsourced to China, not just the mining of critical minerals, but the processing as well. And again, in Alaska and the rest of the country, we have these critical minerals. We can do it in a much more environmentally responsible way than China. We just need to reshore that, focus on this. And again, it's one of these things where the Biden administration is starting to talk a big game on this, understanding it, but the actions that they take, it still continues to undermine what we're doing. Let me give you one example. We have an area in Alaska called the Ambler Mining District. There's a federal law that mandates an EIS for a road to that part of Alaska on federal and state lands. We did a 7-year EIS beginning in the Obama administration, ending in the Trump administration for the development of this road. The same day the President of the United States, President Biden, held a critical minerals summit, supposedly highlighting the importance of critical minerals, the Department of Interior shut down, reversed the record of decision on the EIS for the Ambler Mining District, reversed it and told Alaska to start over again. I mean, it's insanity. The only people praising that were the far left radical enviros and, of course, Xi Jinping and Putin, the dictators of the adversaries we're now facing.
Yeah. And permitting reform in our last couple of minutes,
yes.
or at least revising NEPA, right? I mean, NEPA and the EIS, the environmental impact statement you just mentioned, were designed to provide a better, quicker solution to projects. Correct. Hadn't happened.
Oh no, it's been turned on its head. You know, I'm a permitting reform geek. I must admit, a lot of people think it's boring, it's wonky. I've been focused on these issues way before my time as a U.S. Senator. It's so important to unleash America's incredible potential, whether it's building roads, bridges, highways, whether it's all of the above energy, whether it's critical minerals. The fact that it takes 8-9 years to permit a bridge, the fact that, you know I kind of follow the worst case scenarios. Unfortunately, a lot of them, as you know, happen in Alaska. We had a gold mine in southeast Alaska called the Kensington mine. If you look at the litigation, it took 20 years to permit this mine, right?
Longer than World War II.
Much
4
longer,
times longer
right?
than World War II, right?
I mean, we had a road on the Kenai Peninsula, 35 years for the EIS. I mean, this is killing America. And to me, one of the most important bipartisan areas of agreement is to get permitting reform across the board for our country. It's so critical. Again, the only groups that are opposed are the far left radical groups that don't want to build anything in the country, especially in my state. But most mayors, most governors, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, know that this is critical. So we're going to keep pressing it. I had a nice victory recently here on the Senate floor where the Biden administration had put forward a new NEPA rule on infrastructure permitting. It clearly was intended to delay, probably written by the far left radical enviros out of the White House. We did what's called a Congressional Review Act resolution, which enables the Senate and the House to rescind regulations coming from the executive branch. I led the CRA, as we call it here in the Senate, to rescind this Biden rule. Passed. Bipartisan group of senators voted to rescind Biden's recent new NEPA infrastructure regulation. President said he was going to veto the Sullivan resolution if it comes to his desk. I say, bring it, Mr. President. You're going to be screwing the American worker and so many other groups that want to get rid of your red tape. Let's have that debate. So I'm trying to get it passed, get the House to pass it. We'll put it on the president's desk and see if he actually has the guts to veto a resolution that I guarantee you probably 80% of Americans support.
Well, we'll have to leave it there because our time is up.
Again.
Thank you.
Hudson, this is great what you're doing, particularly on the critical topic of energy security.
We really appreciate your time and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here.